Today, we're going to talk about one of the most overlooked and underutilized aspects of podcasting, but one that if you get right will help so many more people discover your podcast. Let's get into it.
This is the place for podcasters.
Hey, welcome to the channel. Brian here with Summit City Studios, and this is the place for podcasters. On this channel, we talk about tips, tools, and tech to help you create a great podcast. And as you're creating these great podcasts, you want to make sure you have an audience that can find your podcast and that will listen to your podcast. So today, I want to talk about one of the most underutilized resources that you have at your fingertips, and that is your show notes, sometimes called the episode description. And before we get too far into talking about that, let me invite you to stick around to the end of the episode for a big announcement that you might be interested in hearing a little bit more about. So let's talk about show notes. The first question we need to ask is, what are show notes? And it's simply this: they're notes about your show. Or as I mentioned before, sometimes it's called the episode description, and they are embedded right there, most accessibly in the listening app that you happen to be using. Show notes are also posted typically on the website of that podcast, if that podcast has a website, which I would encourage, and we'll talk about that maybe in another video. And to be honest, they can be quite tedious to create, which is why most people just simply don't do it. But I think it's valuable enough that I've created an entire video to help you do it. So let's talk about 3 advantages of creating good show notes. Number 1 is searchability. When you sit down at your computer to do a quick Google search of whatever phrase or keyword or question that you type in there, Google scans websites and it spits out the most relevant results to the word, phrase, or question that you typed in. That's not new information. What you need to know, though, is Google scans primarily text-based websites. So you're going to get a lot of blogs, you're going to get a lot of articles and other things that are text-based. Now, I know you start seeing some videos pop up there, but you're not going to get many podcasts quite yet. Your show notes are a text-based description of your podcast. So when someone types in a word, phrase, or question that you happen to have in your show notes, it's more likely going to show up in a search. Now, it's not a promise that it's going to show up on page 1. There's a lot more work you have to do to ensure that that happens, which maybe we'll talk about in another video. So searchability is number 1. Number 2 is the accessibility of information for your listeners or your audience. Here's what I mean by that. When someone does discover your podcast, some people, myself included, like to know what you're going to talk about before they really invest themselves in listening to however long that podcast is. So what I do is I scroll down and I look through the show notes. I just scan them. What is this podcaster talking about? What is the content? What's the topic? Who's the guest? What are the resources they're pointing me to? And as I scan those show notes, I make a decision on whether or not I am going to invest myself in listening to that podcast. If there's no show notes, I'm probably moving right along. Now, I might be the oddball. Maybe I am. But here's the other side of that. If someone does discover your podcast and begin listening and hear you talk about all these great resources and they want to follow you on social and they want to support you on Patreon and they want to know more about your guests and the books that they've written and all of that, your show notes give them really easy access to all of that if you do it right. We'll talk about that in just a minute. The third reason, and I'll make this one quick, is that good show notes can build trust with your audience. For all the reasons I just mentioned, if they know how to find you and you show up quickly in search, they know what to expect from you and they have easy access to the information and resources that you mentioned, that already builds a baseline of trust for an audience that wants to hear more of what you have to say. Let's move on now and talk about what should be included in your show notes. And as I mention these things, understand I'm talking headings, bullet points, and short sentences, not transcripts and long paragraphs. I don't want to read a book in your show notes. I just need brief information. So keep it short, keep it sweet. The first thing you want to include is a brief episode description. Just a couple of sentences, 2-3 sentences, maybe even some bullet points that let me know what the topic of conversation is in that particular episode, and maybe who your guest is and where they're from. Number 2, I want to know what resources that you talked about in that podcast. So links to the books or the videos or your guest content that they put out there, anything that you mentioned in that podcast that would be helpful to your listener, I want to see the link in the show notes, or at least a link to your website that has all of those links there. Might be a good option to drive traffic to your website. Pro tip right there. The third thing I want to see is your information, your social information. How can I find you as a podcaster? How can I follow you on Instagram or TikTok or Facebook or Twitter or wherever you are? I want to know about that because I like you. So I want to know where I can find you. You might want to include some of that information for your guest as well. And the last thing I would expect to see in some well-written show notes is any additional information that you as the host feel is relevant to your audience. So things like your links to your website, events that you are going to be a part of, ways to contact you if they have questions, or a big announcement that you might have to share. Speaking of big announcements, I have a new podcast coming out late this summer of 2022. The trailer episode is maybe out even right now, depending on when you see this, or it will be out in a couple days. It's called Good Podcasting, and it's all about helping people create, launch, and grow their podcasts, which sounds a lot like this channel. But here's a few differences. Good Podcasting is going to be audio only, and it's going to consist of 2 different types of episodes. One week, I'll be interviewing a podcaster who has carved out a niche and found success in podcasting, and we're going to hear about their story of why they started, how they started, what they started with, and what they've learned along the way. In between those interview episodes, then, you will hear much shorter episodes focused on a particular tip or a tool or a resource that I found that I think would be helpful to you in your podcasting journey. But I'll also talk about the tech that I'm using in those episodes. So I'm going to be trying out different microphones, different mixers, different DAWs, different stands, and all of that, so that you can hear some of the differences and some of the equipment that I'm using. I'll let you know what that is, and if you're interested in any of that, I'll actually put links to all of that in my show notes. If you found this video helpful, let me know that by hitting the like button, and consider subscribing to this channel for more content just like this to help you create a great podcast. And keep an eye out for good podcasting. I'll see you in the next one.